Shigeru Takahashi was not the sort of man war poems were written about. When he'd been drafted into the Japanese Imperial Army, his father had said, "Play with honor, come home alive, and take care not to lose your soul." An accomplished violinist before he ever wore a uniform, Shigeru's hands were more accustomed to the gentle tension of bow against string than the steely grip of a rifle. Yet now he found himself assigned, as the regiment's official musician, to a battalion on the edge of Burma, where thick humidity made even the bravest men weep for home. He played each night in the tented dusk, giving voice to the grief and longing none could name. His violin, battered but resilient, carried the warmth of his family's home in Kyoto. And as haunting notes wound through the jungle, even battle-hardened officers paused to listen. Every melody was a thread connecting the men, even the sullen conscripts from rural Hokkaido, even the gruff sergeant who kept his emotions buried beneath layers of bark-like discipline. For brief minutes, music softened their struggles, though the war outside pressed ever closer. Meanwhile, across a tangled no-man's land, an Allied patrol huddled in silence. Among them, Private Richard "Rich" Collins, an Australian radio operator, hunched over static-laden transmissions, missing his fiancée's laughter, the taste of cold beer, and the clear night skies of home. The air was thick with tension, disease, and the fear of dawn attacks. Yet on certain nights when the wind shifted, a strange, luminous fragment of violin music drifted into Allied trenches. Some men scoffed, "Enemy tricks," but Rich recognized suffering when he heard it. The music did not threaten, it reminded. Unknown to both, their fates would soon tangle irrevocably. The night before a major offensive, Shigeru was summoned by his commanding officer. "Morale is low," the major admitted. "Play something for the men." And so he did, sending melodies spiraling through the makeshift camp. Most wept quietly. A few sang along in broken voices. For Rich, who heard the distant song as he cleaned his weapon in darkness, a wave of memory flooded him, the sound of home, the ache of peace lost. He stood, eyes straining toward the jungle, knowing the man behind that music was not so different from himself. Morning brought shell fire. The Japanese launched a thunderous assault, and Allied troops scrambled for cover. In the chaos, Rich Collins was cut off from his unit when shrapnel shredded the ground between him and safety. Alone, wounded, he staggered deeper into jungle, stumbling into a forgotten stretch where gunfire faded and only the echo of a violin seemed real. By chance, Shigeru, tasked that day with moving rations to the front, had also been separated from his squad by the same madness of battle. War had stripped both men of certainty, leaving nothing but instinct, fear, and the memory of something beautiful left behind. That evening, as the sun bled out over the hostile canopy, Shigeru found a strange figure collapsed near a stream, a pale, bloodied Allied soldier gasping for breath. The musician froze, knowing that mercy could be fatal to either of them. Yet as Rich moaned softly and muttered words from a dream of home, Shigeru was seized not by hatred, but by a memory of the music he played and of suffering made universal by war. He hesitated only a moment before kneeling at the enemy's side, reaching for his canteen, and as gently as any battlefield allowed, sharing water. Rich looked up, recognition flickering in dazed eyes. No words could pass between them, not then, not in any language they shared. In that hour between brutality and nightfall, a violinist's mercy rewrote the script of enemies. The day faded, but the music lingered, neither man knowing how this accidental intersection would change everything that came after. Night fell fast over the Burmese jungle, turning the battered ground to ink. Shigeru Takahashi crouched beside the wounded Allied soldier, uncertain whether compassion would prove deadly. The violinist's fingers, usually so steady atop the strings, trembled as he examined Rich Collins' injuries. Nothing immediately fatal, but the bleeding had to be slowed. Shigeru tore a strip from his own sleeve and bound the wound as best he could. movements gentle, determined not to meet the stranger's fearful gaze. All around, distant gunfire crackled, occasional flares sending brief shadows through the leaves. Shigeru fumbled for words, his scant English failing him, and Rich, half delirious, mumbled phrases in shuddering Australian tones. Unable to speak, they sat together wordlessly, two rivals stranded by violence and fate. Shigeru could hear orders echoing through the darkness and recognized that if a Japanese patrol found him here, saving an enemy would mean execution. But to leave Rich was unthinkable. Years before, his own brother had died because no one stopped to help. Memory thrummed in his mind, pushing him to action. Searching his ration bag, Shigeru found a half loaf of rice bread and pressed it into the soldier's hand. Rich's eyes fluttered, wary but grateful. As the night deepened and the jungle pressed in, Shigeru extracted his battered violin, not to play for comfort, but as silent company, a kind of shield against the noise of war. Rich watched in confusion as the Japanese musician tuned single notes, as if testing the air for peace. Between distant mortars, music floated low and gentle, and Rich realized with sudden clarity where he'd heard it before, across no man's land, transforming dread into longing. They would not sleep. Instead, Shigeru plotted a route to safety. He knew a tributary closer to the Allied border, rarely patrolled due its swamps and biting insects. Rich, regaining some strength, tried to rise, but pain kept him low. Shigeru leaned in, gesturing for silence, then motioned for the soldier to follow as best he could. Together, through tangled brush, moving slowly through shadow and mud, the two men advanced. The jungle seemed alive with threat, but Shigeru's knowledge of sound, how to step quietly, when to pause, gave them an edge. More than once, they had to duck behind massive teak roots as Japanese squads swept past, barely 15 meters distant. Rich relied on Shigeru entirely, the enemy violinist, now his savior. He wondered about this man's family, why he risked his life, why music had ever seeped into a world built by guns. Each answer was found in small gestures, the cupped water at a stream, the hand guiding him over a fallen log, the short notes that marked time and coded caution. As dawn grew near, exhaustion became dangerous. Rich nearly collapsed twice, yet Shigeru refused to let him rest too long, knowing they'd be discovered once daylight revealed their footprints. They pressed closer to the border, music and silence alternating between them in a fragile truce. At last, in the blue dawn, the Allies' outer scouts discovered the pair, guns leveled at Shigeru, uncertain whether this soldier was a kidnapper or a traitor. Rich, spent but clear-eyed, waved them off. "He saved me," he croaked. "He saved me with music and mercy." Commanders hesitated. War had not taught them to expect kindness from the other side. But Rich's testimony moved them, and for a brief, miraculous moment, Shigeru lived not as an enemy combatant, but as a witness to unlikely grace. As the Allied medics tended Rich's wounds, Shigeru was held for questioning. Yet the story of his courage and of the violin that bridged impossible divides slowly changed perception at camp. That night, Rich asked for Shigeru to play just once. And as the notes wound beneath the stars, men from two nations listened together, foes reimagined, if only for the length of a simple song. Word that an enemy musician had risked all to save a wounded Allied soldier spread through the camp like wildfire, challenging the iron-bound categories of foe and friend. Shigeru Takahashi, separated from everything he knew, now found himself treated as something between prisoner and honored guest. Allied authorities, uncertain what to make of his act, subjected him to questioning and observation, while the rank and file oscillated between suspicion and fascination. Private Rich Collins, bandaged, weak but very much alive, insisted daily on Shigeru's humanity. "He's not a spy. He's not a threat," Rich pleaded with Captain Evans, the officer tasked with processing prisoners. "He's just a man with music in his hands and mercy in his heart." The words seemed almost outlandish, yet testimony from surrounding patrols matched parts of Rich's account. Tales of distant violin songs spreading comfort even before their meeting. Initially confined to a tent near the medical area, Shigeru kept to himself, uncertain of his fate. Each day, an interpreter came to question him, sometimes gently, sometimes with the sharpness bred by years of tragedy. Shigeru spoke of his hometown in Kyoto, of a mother's gentle song, and a teacher who once said, "Music is the breath behind silence." He explained as best he could why he'd risked his life to help Collins. "Wounds are the same in any language," he said quietly. "My brother died for lack of compassion. I could not walk away." Gradually, the barriers within the camp softened. A few soldiers, driven more by boredom than malice, began to visit Shigeru out of curiosity, asking about his violin, his training, the sounds he remembered from home. With cautious smiles, he played for them, choosing melodies that felt both familiar and foreign. Japanese folk tunes, bits of Western classical music, and even a tentative attempt at waltzing Matilda, which garnered laughs and applause from the Australians. As the days darkened with rumours of a Japanese counter-offensive, tensions ratcheted up. Some officers argued that having a Japanese POW, even one so obviously non-threatening, could endanger the camp. Others countered that Shigeru's presence and the story of his mercy provided a rare, vital beacon of hope in a world gone brutally simple. One stormy evening, as distant mortars echoed through the forest, Rich hobbled from his cot to Shigeru's tent. The two men, rescuer and rescued, spoke in halting phrases, fragments of English, Japanese, and wild gestures. They found moments of laughter in the absurdity of their situation, sharing hard biscuits when words failed them. At one point, Rich pressed a photo of his fiancée into Shigeru's hands. "She plays piano," Rich explained softly. "Music kept us going. Maybe it did for you too." For Shigeru, the kindness shown by men who hours earlier had seen him as the enemy was overwhelming. He wrote letters, all unsent, to his own family, describing the uncanny blend of loneliness and camaraderie that filled each day. He wondered what would happen to him if the war shifted again, and whether acts of unlikely grace could survive the next round of violence. Capital Evans, finally convinced of Shigeru's sincerity, made a decision. The musician would contribute not by spying, but by lifting spirits. At Evans's insistence, Shigeru gathered his makeshift orchestra, a battered violin, a tinny harmonica, and a pair of homemade drums, and encouraged allied and local musicians to join. For one night, fury gave way to harmony. Under the same moon that once bore witness to violence, soldiers from opposite ends of the world sang, clapped, and remembered that music, like mercy, could survive even war. As the applause faded and the jungle reclaimed its silence, Rich wondered how this fragment of peace could have ever arisen. The answer seemed clear in Shigeru's bowed head. Sometimes it is not brute strength, but a shared song that truly saves a life. As nights blurred into days, the unlikely friendship between Shigeru and Rich Collins deepened, tested by the uneasy equilibrium of war. The Allied camp, once skeptical of the Japanese musician's presence, began to see his daily routines, the careful way he cleaned his violin, the shared smiles with other soldiers, as a gentle challenge to the hard lines of conflict. Even as the jungle simmered with rumor and threat, pockets of peace sprang up wherever Shigeru's notes floated, sometimes near mess tents, sometimes in hurried roadside gatherings. But war would not rest. Orders came down one evening. A Japanese counterattack was imminent. Allied soldiers fortified their positions, weapons oiled and nerves tight. Shigeru, aware of the new tension, faced a dilemma. The officers warned him he might be moved back behind tighter barriers for the camp's safety, separating him from both his music and the hope he'd been quietly nurturing. Rich protested the move, arguing, "If ever we need what Shigeru brings, it's now." Captain Evans listened, weighing protocol against morale, and agreed Shigeru would stay, provided he remain under watch. So on the eve of battle, the violinist played one final song for the entire camp, an improvisation combining Japanese folk motifs with waltzing Matilda. Soldiers from distant villages and cities hummed along, a momentary feeling of unity diffused through the air, an invisible shield against the fear creeping into their hearts. The next morning, the camp braced for attack. Shells roared from distant enemy lines, the sky bruised with smoke as fire and chaos crashed over the clearing. Rich, assigned back to communications, struggled to keep messages flowing amid the din, while Shigeru was ordered to remain near the medical tent, should his skills be needed to soothe the wounded. When a shell burst near the tent, panic erupted. Dozens were injured and confusion reigned. Shigeru moved through the chaos, not with the stride of a soldier, but with the calm of someone who had learned to listen for pain. Ignoring commands to shelter, he attended to a young private crying for his mother, using music and words to calm him as medics worked. Others, overhearing the soft violin notes, felt their breathing slow. Several later recalled how, in the din of bombardment, a simple melody cut through terror. Meanwhile, Rich was called to front-line trenches, relaying positions and needs. Severed lines meant running through open ground. At one point, separated from his squad while carrying a critical message, Rich stumbled into a shell crater just as Japanese troops surged unexpectedly. He froze, visible, exposed, and sure this was the end. But among the attackers, a single voice barked, "Wait!" Shigeru, called forward by medics to help interpret among new POWs, recognized Rich's predicament. Dashing between lines under fire, risking his life, he waved, calling out in broken English, and rushed through debris to Rich's side. With frantic gestures and music hummed through the wreckage, an unmistakable phrase from their nightly sessions, he signaled to the enemy not to shoot. Shigeru's presence and his known identity as a non-combatant swayed the attacking Japanese, who hesitated long enough for Allied medics to reach the pair and drag them to safety. The battle raged for several hours. Losses mounted, but neither Shigeru nor Rich would forget that moment when music, memory, and sheer audacity had stalled the violence just long enough. Afterward, Allied soldiers regarded Shigeru with new respect, wondering how, in the midst of all brutality, notes and trust could change fate's direction. As dusk fell, with battle over, and survivors numbed by loss and relief, Rich found Shigeru cleaning his violin yet again. "Why did you risk it?" he asked. Shigeru smiled, eyes weary but alive. "Because the music we share is louder than any war." In that answer both understood. The greatest acts of defiance were not the ones carved by guns, but by the stubborn persistence of kindness, even in the enemy's shadow. The days after the battle passed in uneasy quiet, the jungle around the Allied camp subdued not by peace but exhaustion. Still, it was a silence brimming with memory. Songs half-remembered, wounds acutely felt. Shigeru Takahashi, whose violin had become both shield and bridge, now lived in a complex limbo. He was neither soldier nor enemy, neither home nor free. Yet as soldiers nursed their injuries and medics made rounds, many found themselves drawn back to the source of an improbable comfort. Captain Evans, watching his men's spirits flag, formally requested Shigeru lead nightly reprieves of music and story, open not just to the camp, but to a few local villages and even stretchered wounded from neighboring posts. This small ritual grew in significance. Allied men, Burmese guerrillas, and Shigeru himself gathered around fires, sharing folk tales and fragments of song that spanned continents. Rich, still weak but improving, was determined to join the ensemble, teaching Shigeru chords from Australian ballads, until their laughter for a while outshouted the frogs and the distant thunder. For Shigeru, music took on a new shape, transforming private lament into collective hope. Even men who'd lost family or comrades came nightly to listen, finding within the violin's voice, sometimes triumphant, sometimes trembling, a temporary healing nobody had expected. In whispered conversations with Rich, Shigeru uncovered new pieces of the puzzle. Their favorite composers, childhood melodies, the stories they'd been told before the world fractured. Yet outside their circle, the war raged on. Fresh orders brought the threat of relocation and renewed fighting. Rumors persisted that Allied command might send Shigeru to an official POW camp, far from the friends whose lives he'd touched. Rich petitioned the officers to spare him, citing the difference Shigeru's presence had made. "He's more valuable than you realize. His music kept us together in our weakest hour." Evans agreed to delay transfer, recognizing the extraordinary worth of hope in the shape of a borrowed violin. Days blurred. Shigeru continued to write letters that would never be sent, tiny lifelines to Kyoto, to the idea of family and peace. Rich, now well enough to return to duty, invited the Japanese musician to a farewell gathering. Both men felt the weight of temporary endings. That last evening by the campfire, Shigeru chose to play only pieces he and Rich had built together, an accidental duet born of war and necessity. The music rippled through soldiers and villagers alike. Even the wounded and grieving found solace in song, proof that humanity, even under siege, could find its own chord. As dawn rose and Shigeru prepared for transfer, officers and enlisted men alike came to bid farewell. Some offered gifts, a harmonica, a scarf, small trinkets of gratitude. Rich pressed a letter into Shigeru's hand, promising friendship beyond borders and songs that waited for peace. The march to the new camp was hard, but Shigeru's heart was buoyed by remembered melodies and unlikely alliances. Rich watched until the procession vanished, knowing their bond would outlast battle, if only because music, like mercy, ignored all orders but its own. For years, many in that camp remembered the Japanese musician whose notes had stilled the wounds of war. When peace finally returned and Rich wrote to Shigeru in care of the Red Cross, their message found its way to a rebuilt house in Kyoto. Promises held, music endured. And so, the man once conscripted to inspire armies had in the end inspired peace, proof that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness echo longer than any war.